This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
You are what you watch.
Good evening, my name is Harry Tumbuatco. Welcome to our program. Ladies and gentlemen, last week we saw our president go to the APEC summit, and together there he met with the world leaders. Interestingly enough, of course, you've got the American president, and then of course you've got the Russian president, Putin. Now, interestingly enough, all the other world leaders came together, but let's not forget, the APEC is an economic forum. It is really not really the place for the president to talk about the China crisis we're having in the West Philippine Sea. One day after the event, after a three-day APEC event, the president goes to Myanmar for the ASEAN summit, which involves the 9 other countries. Interestingly enough, some of the other big countries, the big governments in the world, followed suit and made presentations to the ASEAN. Understandably enough, or better yet, I'm still baffled because Myanmar, where the ASEAN was held, is not a democracy, mind you. It's a military junta that stayed there for the last 10 years. Well, so is Thailand at this point until possibly early next year. What do we know? What do you and I know, other than reading from the newspapers and, of course, CNN and BBC, about the Ukrainian crisis? Every time I go around talking to other people, basically we just know that Vladimir Putin, the prime minister in Russia, is supposedly, allegedly, invading the Ukraine. Now, of course, you've had that cessation, or what we call they've already succeeded in taking one part, the Crimea. Now, why they took that and why they're holding on to the rest of Ukraine, and where that is going, and how that's going to affect us. You have to remember the global scenario. Cause and effect. There is no such thing where something happens in any part of the world that will not have some type of cause and effect relationship to the Philippines. For us here in the Philippines, it is interesting to find out how the relationships of Europe as a whole, the EU, how Ukraine affects them, the relationships with Russia, and of course you've got America versus Russia. But we've known about these two countries over the last 20, 30 years, and we like to look at it as what we call the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, etc., the KGB versus CIA, and all the spy movies that we tend to watch. Well, what exactly is it about Ukraine we should find interesting? Ladies and gentlemen, I finally found a resource person. Thanks to our common friend in the restaurant. I'll plug his restaurant. It's called the Balkan. It's at Perea Street along the Legazpi village in Makati. And the owner is, let me see, he's not Yugoslav. He's from there, not Montenegro. And his name is Martin Milosevic. Batricevic, that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest, attorney Oleg Bilousenko. Did I pronounce that right?
Bilousenko.
Bilousenko.
Kamusta, Harry?
Kamusta?
I'm very pleased to be here.
Yeah. And thanks for taking time out to sit here with us here and to help me analyze exactly how we should understand the crisis in Ukraine. Let's look at the facts. Vladimir Putin of Russia is supposed to have invaded Ukraine, but he says he has not invaded, and he's saying it's the military support, the popular support from inside that wants to go back to Mother Russia. He succeeds about a year ago, and he takes Crimea, which is now in his control. But there are many Russian, if not all Russian-speaking people in Crimea. Is that correct?
That's correct. I actually would say, not supposedly, but Russian troops were on the ground in Crimea, and he actually admitted this week.
He admitted finally.
Admitted that Russian troops, even though he denied when Russians first appeared in Crimea, but later on, actually this week, in his interview to a German newspaper, he admitted that Russian troops were on the ground.
So he took it forcibly.
Obviously, if you look at a referendum which took place in the UK, Scotland, it took a couple of years. Both sides had the opportunity to express their preferences and to argue for their cause. In Crimea, first you see special forces, Russian special forces, which were actually trained by German military experts, occupying official buildings, blocking military...
We saw that on television.
That's correct. That's correct. They didn't have any identification marks referring to Russia. But
how does that strike you? Imagine you have two forces, they're in conflict, obviously, they're shooting each other, but one doesn't have anything that says they're Russian, and yet they're there, and then Russia says, no, they're not necessarily our soldiers.
Well, that's what happened. That's what's happening in the eastern part of Ukraine, where now, even though Putin, when the Canadian Prime Minister at the summit in Australia last week,
the G20,
bluntly told President Putin to get out of Ukraine, according to his press secretary, Putin's response was, well, in order to get out, we need to have forces, and we don't have them, which is contrary to evidence collected by different independent organizations, by Ukrainian government. NATO last week admitted that Russian forces are present in Ukraine, and obviously you have heavy artillery, missiles.
Would you call that invasion? Would you qualify it as invasion with Russian forces? Because Ukraine is an independent republic, correct? It's an independent country.
It's a country, it's an independent country, and it's been independent for more than 20 years.
Okay. Since the break of the USSR.
Yes, and
it's a sovereignty.
It's been sovereign, and actually Russia, together with the US and the UK, signed a memorandum back, I think it's 1991, guaranteeing sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine.
And yet, with the sovereignty and the guarantee of territorial integrity, here comes the Russian power invading. So we can call it invasion.
It's a treacherous act, and I have to, for your viewers, I would like just to put in perspective so you would understand. If we go to the Cold War, all the defenses were built on the western border of Ukraine, while Russia is on the eastern border. So all the training for military officers was about defending against invasion from the west. Right. So there was no military concept defending Ukraine from the east. So why I'm calling it treacherous act? Because nobody, a year ago, nobody could even imagine that Russia would invade Ukraine. That was unimaginable.
Why is it unimaginable? Because they've always been there. It's the training ground. And that's where the Russian forces are right at the border, the eastern border of Ukraine, because they're going to defend themselves, obviously, from the west, using Ukraine as the barrier, so to speak. Is that correct?
Well, considering the history, considering that Ukrainians and Russians fought together against the fascist Germany invasion,
many decades.
Considering, according to some statistics, about almost 30% of military officers in the Russian army have Ukrainian origins. So you have intermarriages, yes.
Ukrainians, many are Russians.
Less than 50%. And you know what, I'd like to be clear about this point. I come from the southern part of Ukraine. I'm a Russian speaker. Yes. So Russian is my mother tongue. Ukrainian was my second mother tongue.
It's different language. Ukrainian is different from Russian.
It's the same family, but they are different. And
accents?
No, it's words. I give you an example. Love. In Ukrainian, it's kohanya. In Russian, it's любовь. Two different words. And it's, there are vocabularies different, and alphabet is, although it's lots of things are in common but quite different. So if you don't know Ukrainian, I don't think you would be able to follow what Ukrainians speak if you only know Russian.
There is a deep relationship between the Russians and the Ukrainians, obviously because of the shared borders and because of
History as well.
history as well. And they always stood together because of the USSR. Or not only because of that.
Not because the first treaty agreement on peace was signed, unity agreement was signed between Ukraine and Russia in the middle of 17th century.
Oh my gosh, it's 200 years.
And Ukraine was desperate. Ukraine was Orthodox and was fighting Poland, which was Catholic at the time. So there was kind of religious conflict and also ethnic conflict.
Allied.
No, Ukraine was part of Poland and Lithuania. But then when Ukraine managed to get independence from Poland, it wasn't strong enough to preserve the independence. And because of the Orthodox religion,
Even the religion. is
the
different.
Ukrainians sided with Russians and they signed a treaty which provided autonomy for Ukraine and independent governance, autonomous governance. But later on, Ekaterina the Great,
What is the religion in Ukraine anyway?
it's a combination, Orthodox, Catholic. We also have a sizable Jewish population.
Oh, interesting.
Odessa, which is in the south, which is a very beautiful city.
Yeah, Odessa is worldwide.
Well, it has one of the best operas in the world.
Odessa.
It's considered to be the informal Jewish capital in the former Soviet Union.
Oh, interesting. What is it with Ukraine that Russia wants, other than they've already worked as allies, they have a deep-rooted history, either way, and Ukraine is identified as another area called Ukraine, regardless of there being an allied force at one time, or even as part of the Union of Soviet Russia, right? But what is it in Ukraine Russia is going after?
You know, there are different theories presented, depending who expresses an opinion. But I would run parallel between Hitler, Germany, and Putin's Russia today, because Hitler was uniting Germans which lived in different countries at the time, and that was one of the pretexts to create a great Germany.
Yes.
Putin, unlike Hitler, Putin is not very successful in terms of economic reforms. Russia, considering the size, the biggest country, by far the biggest country in the world, and the riches in terms of resources, the country which used to be one of the industrial powers in the world, today
Yes.
75% of its exports consist of unprocessed mineral resources. When I studied at Peking University, a professor in economic history, he said, in the economic history of the world, there is one example when an industrialized country turned into mineral resources supplier, and it's Russia. So in a way, population in Russia, large part of the population, lives in a dream of the past successes.
The power, yes.
Of the past successes. And Russia obviously can be proud of its history, art,
Yes.
music, writers, also space programs, etc., etc. But today it's not the case. And Putin, who has been fortunate during the last 15 years because the oil prices have been extremely high compared to early 90s when Yeltsin was in power. But he hasn't conducted any serious economic reforms. And in order for him to stay in power, in my opinion, he needs to give something to Russian people.
Okay, Oleg, we're going to have to stop there. Ladies and gentlemen, when we come back, we will discuss all these other issues that's now coming to play because it's called the oil. It's called about the natural resources, even the military power. Peking was mentioned, meaning China, which is now Beijing. Our guest is a man who seems to have traveled all around the world and has studied a lot of the history. Well, of course, he's a man of the law. Nevertheless, can provide us an insight or a better understanding on how to understand all these issues that are developing. Stay with us. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.